It's Friday, and we are working for Crusoe. Sam, Park and John Ramey with you with a special evening recording on this Friday, December 1st. We were off last week because of Thanksgiving, and I had a cold. So we're going to catch up. Argentina electing a libertarian, chainsaw-wielding, apparently crazy man. I'm saying that hyperbolically, but Javier Milei is making news. He hasn't even been inaugurated yet. The Netherlands have elected a far-right leader in their election. Wilders is his surname. We will talk about how to pronounce his first name. And he may have to form a minority government, it looks like. And it's kind of a tricky path for him. Regrettably, the ceasefire has not held. Hostilities are renewed in the Hamas-Israel war after about a 6-day ceasefire that led to the release of hostages. And Sam Park, that's a good full plate for this Friday.
Well, that's what happens. Well, we all had full plates for Thanksgiving, obviously, but that's what happens when you take a week off. You have to catch up with a bunch of stuff. Thankfully, actually, there weren't that many other things so I think we can easily squeeze in all the things we need to do today.
All right. Javier Milei, president-elect of Argentina, a self-professed libertarian, admirer of Donald Trump. He's an economist by trade.
Yes. And
also looks like Jack Black's stunt double. You mentioned a couple of episodes ago he is a musician who performs in a Rolling Stones tribute band, or has.
He did. I don't think he still does that. He has performed. He was the lead singer of a Rolling Stones tribute band.
I mean, you can kind of see it in his stage presence. He, of course, made headlines by wielding a chainsaw, and the B-roll on this, when you watch coverage of his campaign, is phenomenal because there's this wild-haired man like gesticulating madly with a chainsaw about how
in a crowd, right? He's got people right next to him, and he's running the chainsaw. Yeah,
it's like, it's not like that thing has blanks, It's so yeah, he kind of shot to renown, and his political party is only like 2 years old, and he's far right, a libertarian. He wants to do a bunch of weird things. He wants to dollarize their economy in an attempt to combat inflation, which is like 142%. And he also now says they won't join BRICS because he doesn't want to do business with communists. China, of course, is a huge trading partner for Argentina.
I think they're largest, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it's China, and then it's Brazil. So where to begin with? Again, I call him a madman. He's not, we don't know him to be actually insane, but eccentric. Javier Milei, president-elect of Argentina.
I think we can safely characterize him as eccentric. Sure, I'll go with that.
Okay, so what do you want to talk about first? I mean, just not joining BRICS, that doesn't seem very bright.
Well, first of all, that was, I wouldn't say widely predicted, but it's certainly not a surprise. He is, by his own characterization, an anarcho-libertarian. And so, in a way, you might expect that he would want to join what we've characterized on this program as a sort of authoritarian-leaning group, like the expanded BRICS,
right?
As I've come to call it, the Because Iris grouping. But now I have to abandon that because the A is gone, apparently. Right. But in a kind of weirdly refreshing way, he seems to actually mean it, right? He doesn't want to actually join up with communists. And as we discussed in our episode about the expansion of the BRICS grouping, it really does benefit China more than anybody else. And so from a purely ideological standpoint, it does make sense that Milei doesn't seem to want to join that grouping.
Okay, fine. But they have 142% annualized inflation. Half the population is below the poverty line. And they have like billions due this month to the International Monetary Fund. Like They don't really have, in Argentina, they don't have time to be playing around with ideology, do they?
Well, the fact is, the International Monetary Fund, with whom Milei met this week, by the way, he traveled to Washington, D.C., even before his inauguration to meet with the IMF. of which Argentina is the largest debtor. And so the IMF is generally, historically, that is, a Western-dominated institution. And they're frequently, in fact, these days at loggerheads with China that operates its own, lending programs to various countries under various terms for various reasons. And so if he's trying to make nice with the IMF, and by the way, he has moderated some of his rhetoric ever since winning the election, as you might expect. And he needs the IMF more than he needs China, I think, is the calculation that he's made, at least. Because the IMF has always, if increasingly begrudgingly, come through for Argentina. Whereas when China lends money to countries, many of those countries end up experiencing some form of borrower's remorse. They feel that the sort of repayment terms are too onerous, whereas the IMF, again, begrudgingly, has forgiven certain tranches of debt owed to them by certain countries over time. And so I think that Milei calculates, probably correctly, by the way, that the IMF is the better bet as someone to lend his country money. And as you say, there are numerous economic crises that Argentina has been experiencing for a number of years now, to the point where it sort of it feels routine to us here in the West. It's like, oh, well, Argentina's having economic problems. Tell me something I don't know. But this is by far the worst shape that their economy has been in for decades. And again, we're talking about a country that's normally an economic basket case. But as you know, you listed a number of these. They have a debt crisis. They have an inflation crisis. They have a currency crisis. And so still and all, though, Milei has not backed off of any of the really radical economic policies that he campaigned on. And so we'll have to see how these things all shake up. For instance, as you say, he wants to abolish the central bank and therefore convert the currency from the Argentinian peso to the US dollar.
Okay, I did some reading on this. First of all, that has been tried in the past twice in Latin America, and it was like Ecuador and Panama.
Yes.
Those are tiny economies.
That's right.
And this was also like 100 years ago. Tiny economies compared to Argentina, which is the third largest economy in Latin America, behind only Brazil and Mexico.
In spite of everything. That's right. Yes.
And they've already had a currency change that I can recall when they went from the Austral to the peso in the 90s, right? And
that's
another
right.
One of these cyclical currency crises. But to dollarize the economy would be giving up so much autonomy, wouldn't it?
That's right. And there's some debate amongst economists as to whether this could even be done.
And he's an economist by trade, but like this is not a mainstream position.
Certainly not. But there are economists who think it is, in fact, possible. And not, maniacs or anything like that, but, actual academic economists. And Milei himself says it will take at least 2 years. And I think that might be optimistic, right? But for instance, anybody who has any money in Argentina today, as quickly as they can, will buy cash dollars with it, either on the official market or on the black market, and they'll literally have packets of American cash in a safe in their home or in their sock drawer, because as the currency continues to lose value, the dollar will only buy you more pesos. This is, by the way, only a sort of stopgap measure, because if the peso is constantly losing value, sure, you're getting more pesos when you cash in your dollar, but those pesos aren't worth as much as they were when you bought the dollars to begin with. You're not getting ahead of anything this way.
No, you're just plugging the leak in the boat.
Exactly. But the point is that the Argentinian economy is already partly dollarized, right? He's not
right. There's a de facto dollarization that has just kind of organically grown up.
That's right. But the scale of completing the dollarization would be so large that it's difficult to see how it could actually be accomplished. So this is something that we're going to want to keep an eye on. And fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you want to look at it, there's no real stakes involved for us here in the United States as to how this process turns out.
Except for he's great media with his wild hair and his antics and his chainsaw.
Yeah, that's what I meant by no real stakes, John.
Right. Okay.
So try and keep up here. Okay?
Sorry, I have journalist brain. Yeah.
Yeah, apparently.
He also said, I think during his visit to Washington, he said, our allies will be the United States and Israel. Right. Like there are just so many deeply unserious things about this man who has been elected president of Argentina.
Why is that unserious? I don't understand. What do you mean by that?
It doesn't sound very evolved. Like he's a Trump fan, right?
Sure.
He's only gonna worry about being allies with Israel and the United States. I mean, that's just it seems very ideological, right? And it
certainly is. Yeah.
And that I think in the experience of doing this podcast with you, that doesn't seem to be the most enlightened way to conduct foreign policy.
Okay, I would agree with you, but the idea that
but hey, I guess that's what got him elected too.
Yes, exactly. He did win handsomely, by the way. And the idea that anybody, any leader of any country, not least in Latin America, would be rather ideological is not.
No, true.
It's not really that surprising. It's just that his character is so over the top that it's we might be more disposed to thinking of him clownishly than perhaps we ought to be.
And as you talk about his dealings with the IMF as opposed to China, that makes sense. I mean, certainly that is a model that works in politics, right? Boris in the UK kind of acts like a boob, is shrewd.
In his way, yes, although it didn't serve him very well by the end.
One other thing, and we'll get off Argentina, but and this is just me editorializing, and I think you will understand this. Anybody who says they're a libertarian, I have a hard time taking seriously. Right.
I agree with you, especially if they're going to be the head of the government.
Right. He's going to slash government spending, no stimulus. It's a weird playbook.
It is, but it just goes to show you how dire the economic problems have become in Argentina, that they're willing to take a chance on a guy like this, who again won a resounding victory in the runoff.
All right. Speaking of far right election winners, can we before we move to Netherlands, are we okay calling Javier Milei far right, or should we just call him a narco libertarian?
I think I'd stick with the narco libertarian because he's so far out of any real category. Like we said,
he's not on the continuum.
No, he's sort of off to sort of adjacent to the continuum.
Yeah.
Right. He's within he's within visual distance, but he's not really on it in a weird kind of way. And I think part of it has to do with just being South American, right? Just sort of geographically isolated from the rest of the kind of interlocking web of international relations in a way. We'll see. Well, again, it'll be something to keep an eye on.
Okay, the Dutch have definitely elected a far right politician.
Yes, Geert Wilders.
Geert Wilders, spelled Geert. And it looks like Wilders, but you're going with Geert Wilders.
I'm very confident that it's Wilders.
Yes.
Geert, I'm a little shaky on. I'm not quite certain about my Dutch pronunciation. I don't really have a good handle on it. I'm given to understand, though, that it's Geert Wilders.
Dutch is a challenging language, and the Dutch are a fascinating people. And they have elected this guy who's been on the scene for some time. I have seen Wilders' name probably at least for a decade.
Yes, many years. Yeah, I think 2006 he first started to gain a lot of prominence.
So he's won this election with his Freedom Party, right? But he doesn't have a majority. He's just got a plurality.
Yes.
And then the two biggest right-leaning parties that would help him form a coalition government are like, no way, buddy, lose our number.
In the beginning, right after he won, it seemed like the main one was willing to work with him.
The outgoing Prime Minister Rutte of the conservative
Mark Rutte, yes, that's right.
VVD party.
Yes. But they changed their mind.
So they're willing to like work with him on issues they agree on, like immigration. Surprise, surprise. But yeah, they're not looking to like actually join the cabinet.
That's right. So we're going to have to see if he can even form a government. And if not, then I guess they might have to have a new set of elections. I'm not sure that that's going to solve the problem, but we're just going to have to see. And I wonder, because Wilders is very anti-immigrant, but as you're saying, right, very anti-Muslim. And I wonder if the recent outbreak of war in the Middle East might have pushed the idea of Islamic extremist terrorism up a few notches in the voter priority sort of spectrum. That's pure speculation on my part. I've not seen any data to back that idea up. But it was sort of a surprise, apparently, that Wilders won the election after so many years.
Yeah, he's been kicking around. He's been on talk shows.
Yeah, and right after,
even in the States.
Sure, right after he won, it was one of these things like, I'm going to Disneyland. He just seemed, he was dumbfounded. And so we'll have to see if he can actually form a government. I don't know enough about Dutch politics. I don't pay a lot of attention to it because it's such a small country that it's not really going to have, again, sort of like Argentina, although for different reasons, it's not going to have all that much impact other than as a sort of signpost. For instance, when Robert Fico won the elections in Slovakia a month or two ago, he was another far-right nationalist type of candidate, but Slovakia is a tiny country, so it doesn't make that big a difference. And we might broaden this out a little bit. It seems as though in Europe, that is, far-right extremist candidates do well in small countries. And that would seem to make sense because it doesn't take a lot of votes to swing the outcome one way or another. But
immigration has a more outsized impact on the demography of a small country.
Very much so, yes. And whereas it's harder to swing the outcome in a larger country where more mainstream candidates have been more successful this year, for instance, as in Poland and Spain. And so that is sort of a little bit of a relief, I guess, that, in the countries that matter the most, these sorts of candidates in Europe again, right, aren't doing quite as well as they are in the larger country.
So we talked about the Conservative Party and outgoing Prime Minister Mark Rutte.
Yes.
That would be one group that will not play ball, at least as far as joining the coalition with Wilders. There's another party called the New Social Contract Party. They're center-right. Yes. And their leader is a guy called Peter Omtzigt, I believe, is how you say that. And they won't deal with Wilders specifically because of his anti-Islam rhetoric. And they generally think he has unconstitutional positions on immigration. So that's a non-starter too. Exactly.
And there are so many parties in the Netherlands that Wilders' victory, he only had 30% or something, right? It's not like he has a commanding majority or something
24.
Like this. Yeah,
24%.
20, even worse for him, right? And obviously none of the left-leaning parties are going to work with him at all. So,
their quote was, "It's impossible, a no-go."
Right. And so, what's he going to do? It's difficult to imagine, but you never know how these things could shake out.
Okay, let's move to Hamas and Israel and the war in Gaza. There was a ceasefire on the 22nd of November. Initially, was to be a 4-day pause or lull in hostilities. This allowed for the initial release of 50 hostages. There were subsequent hostage releases as the ceasefire lasted until about the 28th of November. And then there were reports of violations of that ceasefire agreement. And the resumption of hostilities began, sadly, today, the 1st of December in the morning in Gaza. And Antony Blinken, the United States Secretary of State, confirmed that it was mostly Hamas's, or not mostly, he said it was Hamas who did not honor the terms of the ceasefire, and then Israel started the war back up again. It is surreal to think about it like a timeout in a basketball game, right? And then, okay, let's start the war again.
It's nothing at all like a timeout in the basketball game.
I mean,
first of all, and for instance, you don't extend the timeout because hostages are released in basketball, right?
Right.
And so,
it's just war is such an insane thing to conceive of that there are rules seems absurd. But of course, there are agreements, and this is a good thing that this happened.
Absolutely,
it's a sad thing that it stopped, but that's just.
But its shelf life was limited anyway.
Sure.
Right? There are only so many hostages that Hamas had left, and once they'd freed all of them, then the war was going to start back up regardless. But you're right; it's great that some of the hostages were released. That's the main thing. But more broadly, I would say, is that it demonstrated to everybody, not just the combatants, but everybody in the world who's paying attention to this, that there is something to be gained from negotiation, even amongst bitter enemies such as these. And so, yes, I think that's the main disappointment for me about the collapse of the ceasefire is that it just seems as though the gains from negotiations have been, at least for the time being, exhausted. But it was important that the ceasefire was instituted to begin with, just to demonstrate the importance of negotiation.
The fact that we're only talking about a ceasefire and hostages is a good thing. It means that maybe the threat of this expanding into a regional conflict for the moment has moderated.
I would agree with that, yes. And that's, as you say,
that's
a very good sign. But we don't know how this is going to play out in the future. But for instance, you cite these numbers about the dire conditions in Gaza, and it is awful. But so far, these are just reports. There's been very little firsthand media coverage inside of Gaza, but there will be eventually. And I think I've mentioned this on the show before. And once reporters get into Gaza and see what things are going to be like, it's going to be nightmarish. And so people just, I think, need to prepare themselves for this. It's going to be something like we've seldom seen anywhere. And again, I think it'll be very difficult to deal with. And for me, there's already a lot of sort of, professional commentators, God bless them, right, who have begun to talk about, well, what happens the day after? Who's going to run Gaza? If Israel succeeds in eradicating Hamas, or at least damaging them enough that they can no longer be in charge of Gaza.
It's a legitimate question.
It is. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't ask about this, but I think we should at the same time ask, what will there be of Gaza to run for anybody? I saw prior to the one last week, that is, parts of Gaza, according to an article in the Associated Press, resemble a moonscape,
right,
was the word they used. And where will there actually be for people to live?
If you think about relatively recent examples in history, there was a Marshall Plan after the Second World War, right? Is Israel really prepared to implement their version of the Marshall Plan in Gaza afterwards? Because if they don't, they're going to have this same problem again, right?
Well, if not worse, right? I mean, but
you think about it, the United States and the Allies leveled Japan and leveled Germany and made sure they rebuilt them.
That's right. Now, I would say that
it wasn't altruism, right? It's for security.
Exactly. And I would say that this is an opportunity for the Arab states to step up in this specific regard. For instance, they've already said numerous times that they don't really want to be in charge of security for Gaza afterwards. I think they might be prevailed upon to change their mind about that. Right? They say, well, we don't want to.
Specifically Egypt.
Yes, they don't want to go into Gaza in the back of Israeli tanks, right? And that makes sense because it makes them seem like collaborators, which a lot of Palestinians consider them to be already, by the way. But they could sort of mitigate that reputation that they have amongst the Palestinians if they could help reconstruct Gaza after the war, whenever that is. But Israel has said that they have not changed the aims of the war. It's just a pause, and it was just a pause in the war. Antony Blinken yesterday was saying that Israel needs to do a better job in their planned operations in the south of Gaza, protecting civilian lives, than they did in the north of Gaza. I think Palestinians, with some justification, consider that to just be rhetoric, right? Because what's the United States going to do if Israel fails to do that? Right. Probably not much. And this presents difficulties for the United States, which I'm sure, if our Congress weren't quite so dysfunctional, might come up with an aid package for Gaza afterwards. I can't see that getting through this Congress as it's constituted today. And so that will have to wait at least a year, if it happens at all, which I'm not especially optimistic about.
We have talked about this, just not on our podcast, but with the state of the world and the multiple potential wars, or the hot war in Europe with Russia and Ukraine, and now this in Gaza, the tension over Taiwan. Every day that the sun rises and sets and a larger global conflict has not erupted speaks so well of the international leadership of President Biden. And I think that's right. It is fascinating how, maybe it's not fascinating. I guess pundits have been telling us for our entire lives that Americans don't vote about foreign policy. But that just, I don't quite buy that. People seem to want to win the Cold War, and they voted like it.
Well, this I think is a good segue into our final segment. During the Cold War, we had a bipolar superpower structure. Today, we have a multipolar world, and that's just the fact, right? What the United States wants isn't all that important in the grand scheme of things anymore. And that's partly because of China, but also other rising powers like India and the global South generally, who aren't all that powerful yet, but just because, again, as we've discussed, just because of sheer demography, they're going to want a greater say in how things are done. And this will be something we discuss in our conversations in the coming weeks about COP28, the environmental and climate change summit being held right now in the United Arab Emirates. The global South is going to want to have their voices heard on that particular issue. The poorer countries of the world, who are going to be the great victims of climate change and already are. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced this month, or last month, I should say, by catastrophic flooding in the Horn of Africa. People in Kenya, Somalia, Uganda, Burundi, hundreds of thousands of people, no homes left to go to. Not hearing about this. It's all Israel, and we're not even hearing about Ukraine, which was the top story, and now you barely hear it mentioned at all. But these people in Africa, they might as well not exist as far as our media is concerned. There's an actual genocide happening in Sudan right now. Nobody cares. Now, I get it, right? Israel is one of our longest standing allies. We have direct diplomatic relations at stake in that conflict. I understand that. But the idea that we shouldn't talk about these other things at all, it's obscene. And for instance, when Antony Blinken correctly says that Israel needs to make sure they follow the laws of war and the laws of armed conflict, a lot of people in many countries, including this one, think that to hear any American say that is a sick joke. And one of the people most responsible for them thinking that way was Henry Kissinger, who died this week at the age of 100. And if only for his authorization, again, under the aegis of Richard Nixon, who was president at the time, and Kissinger was his national security advisor, but Kissinger signed off on the bombing of Cambodia, which killed hundreds of thousands of people. This was during the Vietnam War. Cambodia was not a combatant country in that war, but Nixon, with the help of Kissinger, bombed them anyway. And I'm very comfortable talking about Henry Kissinger as a war criminal. And if people want to quibble about that, that's fine. But I'm very convinced about this. And
you're not alone, Sam. This is not a radical position.
No, of course not.
Yeah.
And it's been baffling to me over the years why people still pay so much attention and respect to Kissinger. And I think his death helped me figure that out. It's partly because in the bipolar Cold War superpower equation,
he was a bastard, but he was our bastard.
No, not that, but he and people of his generation created the entire international relations architecture after the Second World War, and he was in on that from the beginning.
Right.
And he happened to live longer than anybody else from that generation. He died at 100 years old. But the other thing about it was that he would never shut up. His own insistence that he was a consequential person that you still needed to listen to, even though he left office, he left public life almost half his life ago, right? 50 years ago. In fact, we know that the Hamas atrocities occurred on the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. Kissinger, and this is one of the few positive things he did, right? Helped set up the peace negotiations that ended that war and later led to the full-on peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. And I think this was I have no trouble saying that was a positive outcome. But just about every other thing he did, the coup in Chile, I mean, these things are awful. But what I find ironic is that was 1973, the Yom Kippur War. And that was basically the last consequential action he took in public life, half his lifetime ago. And yet he's for the rest of his life insisted that people still needed to talk to him.
And his lasting legacy is undermining American credibility.
That's right. I mean, one of them, certainly. And I think it's really just kind of revolting. And I think the consequences of his having done that are enormous and very negative. And people might have been willing to forget about him if he'd had the sense to just shut up and fade off into retirement like all of his peers, by the way. Right? You never hear from Condoleezza Rice, right? You never hear from, I don't know, whoever Bill Clinton's Secretary of State was, or any of these people, right? They retire and they let the professionals who are working for the elected leadership do their jobs instead of having to chime in about everything themselves. But Kissinger would never do that. And so if people feel he's being treated unfairly, then in some ways it's because he brought that on himself by keeping himself in the public eye.
A fascinating end to this episode. And, you and I have talked about Kissinger over the years, and I think I fell victim to the fact that, well, he's just an elder statesman, right? We should want to know what he has to say about things.
Eldest statesman, yes.
Yeah, right. And you we've had many conversations about this that you've said, look, nobody should ask him what he thinks about these things. It doesn't matter. He blew it, right?
Yeah.
More or less. And it is interesting to reflect on that now.
I would say, though,
as the world order that he helped establish is very clearly unraveling.
Yes, but that's not his fault, though, right?
No, no. That's just pressure of history.
But a number of years ago, my sister gave me a copy of a book written about him by the British historian Neil Ferguson, or perhaps.
Sorry, you got a minute before we're done. Just a heads up.
I understand that.
Yeah,
and it's fascinating because his career, again, at the beginning of the post-war period, is a really interesting lens through which we can view those years. As much as I despised him, it's a good read. And so I would actually recommend that to anybody.
That's Neil Ferguson's book on Kissinger?
That's right. Called The Idealist.
All right, next week, COP28, which is the 2023 United Nations Climate Change Conference. But confusingly, they started counting in the late 90s, so it's COP28. Update on the Middle East, of course. Good to be back. Have a good weekend, everybody. He's Sam Park. I'm John Ramey.
Thanks, folks.